Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading. Standing Where the Buddha Stood. January 18, 2005. In all the passages where the Buddha describes his awakening, he talks about RST going through the different levels of jhana. Once he had stabilized his mind in good solid strong states of concentration, he directed it to insight, which means that the insights he got were the way experience looks from the point of view of someone in good strong concentration. That's where all the terms, all the ideas and concepts come from. So if you want to understand the ideas and concepts, you have to put yourself in the same place. This is why we spend so much time working on concentration. To get the mind in the right spot centered in the fourth jhana, with bright awareness ling the whole body. The in and out breathing at that point is still. The mind is still. Breath energy still exists in the body, but the in and out breathing has calmed down and stopped. And you learn to stay there. The issues that come up in the mind while you're learning to stay there. Those are the issues that shaped the Buddha's terminology. The concepts he used, say, about fabrication. What does fabrication look like to someone in good solid concentration? The Buddha talks about 3 levels of fabrication. Bodily fabrication, which is the breath, verbal fabrication, which is directed thought and evaluation, and then mental fabrication, feelings and perceptions. As you move the mind through the levels of jhana, directed thought and evaluation get abandoned on the second level. That's where they grow still. Then bodily fabrication, the in and out breath, grows still in the fourth. What you've got left at that point are feelings and perceptions. These are the big issues, because as the Buddha pointed out, feelings are the basis for craving. When the mind is there in the fourth jhana, you can see this very clearly. The perceptions are what shape your awareness of what you're experiencing. You can see this fact clearly as well. There are other passages where the Buddha talks about the formless levels, and each of them is based on the fourth jhana. You take the same equanimity, the same mindfulness you developed in the fourth jhana and simply change the perception. So when you want to understand feeling or perception, this is the place to do it. Get the mind really well centered, and then you can watch these things as they affect the mind. You can see where they come from, where they go. You can see their allure, you can see their drawbacks. All the things you're supposed to see are best seen right here. When you divide things up in the mind before you hit this spot, it's like taking a knife and cutting across the grain, or cutting things up in whatever shapes you may want. You're not cutting them up from the right perspective. And so you often misapply the terms, you misunderstand what the Buddha is getting at, because you're not in the same place where he was. It's like taking a guidebook to Paris and then landing in Rome. You look around Rome and you try to identify all of the landmarks in Paris. This is a guidebook without pictures. You see a tall tower and tell yourself, well, that must be the Eiffel Tower. You see St. Peter's and tell yourself, that must be the Cathedral of Notre Dame. But you're looking from the wrong spot. This is why the practice of good strong concentration lies at the heart of the path. You're putting yourself in the Buddha's place. You're standing where the Buddha stood. That way you can learn in the same way that the Buddha learned. There's passage in Richard Feynman where he says that the duty of every generation of scientists is to try to prove or disprove what has been handed down in the tradition. The same holds true in the practice of the Dhamma. We're here to prove or disprove what the Buddha taught. The way to do it is to follow his method. And this is his method. Get the mind centered. In the course of centering the mind, you develop good qualities. mindfulness, alertness, the ability to keep the mind with one frame of reference, without slipping over to other frames of reference. That's why mindfulness practice is such an important build-up to concentration. Practice. The Buddha also says that you have to develop tranquility and powers of insight. Tranquility is developed by steadying the mind, insight, by investigating this process of fabrication. Concentration practice is a good place to see this, because you see different levels of fabrication falling away as the mind gets more and more still, and these are the important fabrications. The fact that trees and mountains are fabricated. That's their business, their issue. Our issue is the fabrications coming up in the mind. What they do to us, and what we do to them. So you get the mind centered and start asking questions. Actually, as you've been centering it, you're already asking questions. Why is it that some days you follow a particular set of steps, and they lead to one set of results, while the next day they lead to a different set of results? What did you do differently? Where will you look? Sometimes you have to look at where the mind is to begin with. And then you have to look at exactly how clearly you remember the series of steps you followed, and how clearly you're aware of what you're doing right now. How honest are you with yourself? As the Buddha once said, that was the prerequisite for all Dhamma practice. Give me a person who is honest, he said, and I will teach that person the Dhamma. And he doesn't mean just being honest with the teacher. You have to be honest with yourself about what you're doing, what results you're getting. Once the mind settles down and you're in this spot of being centered with the breath still, with your awareness linked the body, there's a more renewed level of questions to ask. This where you have to improvise. As the Buddha said, sometimes looking at things in terms of the V aggregates is what provides the important insights. Sometimes you have to look in terms of the 6 sense spheres, sometimes in terms of dependent co-arising, sometimes in terms of the 6 elements. You never know beforehand which kind of analysis is going to be right for you. You have to notice, as you're meditating, which kind of analysis you feel more of an affinity for, more of a rapport with. You've got to test it. You've got to play with these things. Some people don't like the word play because it doesn't sound serious enough, but all intelligence comes from the ability to improvise. If you simply do what's in the books, you're not following the Buddha's method. The Buddha didn't follow what was in books. He had to use his own powers of ingenuity. We have the advantage that we're building on the discoveries he made, but we still have to go back and make those same discoveries for ourselves. We have to use the same method he used. And one element in that method is this ability to improvise. Again, Richard Feynman, a British physicist who went to study with Feynman in Cornell, was amazed by, on the one hand, how brilliant he was in physics, but also how playful he was. After a while he realized that the two were connected. If you don't learn to play around with ideas, you don't see new things. If you don't learn to play around with what's happening in the mind, you don't make any discoveries. The Buddha was the type of person who made discoveries. You have to make yourself the type of person who makes discoveries, even if it's simply to recon what he discovered. You have to go through the same process, really testing things. Ajahn Mahabua would often say, try to prove the Buddha wrong. Because it's only when you've done your best to prove him wrong that you can be sure that you've really proved him right. Otherwise there's always a possibility that you're simply programming your mind to think in a certain way. You tell yourself, if you see there's no self, if you see that all things are empty, that must be awakening. But that's not the case. You can't clone awakening. It's always an unexpected discovery when it comes. It never comes quite the way you conceived it. So even though the Buddha gave us his discoveries, and they've been passed down for all these generations, we have to keep reproving them for ourselves, because we have to keep checking our understanding of what he had to say. All of the discoveries he tells us about are in words that we can look up in the dictionary. We can understand the words, but we're coming from ignorance, so our understanding of the words is an ignorant understanding. We can never be quite sure that we really understand what he had to say. If we really understood, things would open up. There'd be awakening. But the fact that there's no awakening yet means that we don't yet understand. So we have to keep testing things, trying new approaches to Gur where we're still ignorant, where our blind spots still are. If you don't improvise, if you don't play, you don't see. The intelligence of a new discovery just doesn't happen. So the important thing here is the method, and the heart of the method is how to get the mind centered in such a way that it's both still and alert. Aware all around, with everything very still. See what the movements of the mind look like from that perspective. See how you can experiment with them from that perspective, asking the kinds of questions the Buddha recommends. Watch things arise, watch them pass away, look for what their allure is, what makes them attractive. Look for their drawbacks, look for their escape from them, the release from them. The Buddha was confident enough in his method that he encouraged people to test it for themselves. You can't go just by what your teacher says, he told the Kalamas. So when you're testing his teaching, make sure you've got the method right, and see if you can prove for yourself whether what the Buddha said was true. That there really is a deathless element, and that you really can achieve it through your own efforts. Battling Darkness. August 6, 2005. One of the standard analogies for meditation is that you're going into battle with all the habits of the mind that create suffering. They're called dilemmas because they darken the mind. As the Buddha once said, the mind is luminous, but these dilemmas come creeping in. If the mind didn't have some luminosity, you wouldn't be able to develop it. Everything would stay murky and dark. But the mind does have a knowing nature. It does have the capability of seeing things clearly both inside and out, just that the dilemmas get in the way. They're like clouds that obscure the sun. So these are the things that we're going to battle. Fortunately, they're not clouds. If you tried to do battle with clouds, you'd really be up a creek. If you tried to cut through a cloud, what would there be to cut through? But if you take the analogy that you're going into battle, you can start thinking about how people wage war, how they engage in a successful GHT. The RST thing, of course, is learning how to pick your battles. There are a lot of things you could GHT about, but you'd waste your energy. If you waste your energy on the trivial things, then when the important things come, you're not up for them. This is why we have to focus our energies on one issue, and that issue is: why does the mind create suffering for itself? Everything we do, we think we're doing it for the sake of happiness, for the sake of our well-being, and yet we end up doing things that cause suffering, both for ourselves and for those around us. Many times we see it very blatantly right before our eyes that, yes, this suffering is dependent on what we're doing, and yet we seem compelled to do it. This is the important issue. If you can take care of this one issue, all other issues are going to get resolved. So you focus on the qualities of mind that lead you to cause suffering. Those are the things you're going to battle. Once you've chosen your battle, the next step is to end a good stronghold, a place where you're secure, where you have the advantage over the enemy. This is why we practice concentration. This is why we develop mindfulness of the present moment. This is going to be your stronghold because this is where you can see these things in action. So you want to create a place here in the present that's comfortable, where you feel at ease, where you feel secure, where you feel solid. Start out by staying with the breath and just keep reminding yourself not to get entangled in any other issues right now. If other issues do come up, fend them out just to the extent you need in order to create a space so you can get back to the breath, to a sense of ease, a sense of well-being with the breath, so that the breath feels full as you breathe in, full as you breathe out. You're not squeezing out the energy of the body as you breathe out, you're not building up tension as you breathe in. Allow the breath to come in and out with a sense of fullness that you can maintain both through the in-breath and through the out. Then let that sense of fullness spread through the body. That's your stronghold. Get so that you can stay here in all situations, because you're going to need your stronghold in all situations. There will be times when you venture out to do battle with the enemy and realize that the enemy has more troops than you expected, so you need to beat a strategic retreat. You need a good place to retreat to, a place to come back to no matter what the situation. So try to get familiar with this spot where the breath feels comfortable in the body, where the mind feels at ease with the breath. That's your stronghold. It's from this position that you can do your work of insight. The qualities of insight, discernment, wisdom are like a sword. They cut through all the confusion, they cut through all the connections that keep those dilemmas together, that keep them strong. As you get to know the movements of your mind, you begin to see that there are lots of little events in the mind that you tie together. You connect this one with that one with this one, and all of a sudden you've strung together a huge enemy. You tell narratives that connect this event with that feeling and that feeling with that event, and then it becomes a huge web by which you catch yourself. So you've got to learn to cut through that web. The nature of insight, as the Buddha said, is in seeing things in V ways, or in understanding V things about whatever the dilemma is, whatever the story is. Step 1 is learning simply how to watch it arise. Step 2, watch it pass away. Learn to see these things simply as events that come and go in the mind. That helps give you some distance from them. In other words, when a story world comes up in your mind, you don't jump into the world. You look at it as an outsider. It's the same as when you drive past a drive-in theater and see a LM up on the screen. If you allow yourself to get sucked into the idea that there's actually a story being portrayed up there, you could drive over the road. But if you simply see it as lights moving on the screen, you don't get sucked in. That helps to dismantle any reality you'd give to the LM. The same holds true with the mind. We give all kinds of trust and reality to the thought constructs that come up in the mind, but if you learn to see them simply as events, little rings of the synapses, you cut through any compulsion to get involved in that storyline all over again. When you can pull yourself out of that thought world, you begin to see the construction that goes into maintaining it. And particularly, you want to see two things about the way it's constructed. These are steps 3 and 4. 3 is, what gratification do you get out of that thought world? Even though it may be causing you suffering, there must be some pleasure, some gratification in creating it. Otherwise you wouldn't indulge in it. It would hold no attraction at all. So learn to look for where that gratification is. Sometimes, when you see it, you'll feel ashamed that you could have fallen for it. Then, step 4, look for the drawbacks. If you stick with that thought world, what is it going to do? Where does it lead you? Some of the drawbacks you'll see immediately with the sense of tension, with the sense of dis-ease that arises both mentally and physically as you create and consume that thought world. Some of the drawbacks will come later. You've got to learn to look for both. The most difficult step is the FTH. Learn to see the escape from that thought world, from that pattern, from that habit. Sometimes just looking at the arising and passing away of the thought world is enough to undercut any sense of reality or trustworthiness in the thought world, and it will go away. Other thought worlds are more compelling. You have to look very carefully to see the gratification, to see the drawbacks, and you have to use your imagination to end the escape. This is not just a passive process of watching arising and passing away. You have to see where in the mind there's that little voice telling you that you've got to believe in this narrative about that thought world, that you can't do it any other way. There will be that voice with its repeated message. That's why it's called a compulsion. A lot of our compulsions come from the fact that we can't imagine any other way of reacting to a particular memory or a particular idea. Our imaginations are limited and sometimes dishonest. To break out of the limitations and shake out the dishonesty, you have to sit down and very consciously try to think of other ways of reacting. One compulsion is the part of you says, you've got to get upset whenever this memory comes back. If you don't get upset, you're just being a milquitoist. People are going to walk all over you. Put a question mark next to that, and then check to see what other voices come up. Whatever the voices, learn how to put question marks next to them, too. The simple act of questioning reminds you that there's an alternative. Ask yourself, does that have to be true? What if the opposite were true? And just that much can be enough to jolt your imagination to think in other ways to get out of the rut of that particular dilemma, whether it's greed, anger, delusion, lust, fear, pride, jealousy, whatever. Learning how to cut through any dilemma requires a knowledge that has these V aspects. Seeing it arising, seeing it passing away, seeing its gratification, seeing its drawbacks, and then seeing the escape from it. When your sword can cut in all the directions in this way, you begin to appreciate what meditation can do. It really does free you from the mind's old habits of creating suffering for itself, the habits that keep telling you, I'm doing this, I'm doing that because I want to be happy. You have to do things this way in order for happiness to be found, and yet turning up with unhappiness as a result. There's a wrong connection in there that you've got to cut through, and this V-edged knowledge is what allows you to cut it. So these are your basic strategies, your basic weapons. First, you've got to choose the right battle. That's why we have right view. Then you need a stronghold, a safe place from which to launch your attack. That's what the concentration is for. And then you have to look at the events in the mind from these V angles. That's your sword. When you're equipped in this way, you can take on the really essential battle in life, which is to free yourself from suffering. You've got the tools, the weapons you need to win. It's all very basic, but so many times in life we miss out on the good things because we overlook the basics. So learn how to appreciate the basics, because they're the things that can really help you. Perception. August 19, 2005. That phrase in the chant just now, those who don't discern suffering, sounds a little strange, doesn't it? You'd think that everybody would discern suffering, but the verb here is important. Everybody experiences suffering, but not everybody discerns it. Discerning means to understand, to see it for what it is, to the point where you can let it go and put an end to it. That requires looking at it very carefully. And for all the suffering we go through in our lives, we look at so little very carefully. That's our problem. We have a lot of ideas about suffering, but have you ever stopped to ask yourself, where did you pick up those ideas? Some of them go way back to before you even knew language. The RST thing that happened after you were born was that you cried unless you were too stunned even to cry, and they had to spank you to make you cry. You even experienced suffering in the womb. There's a story in the canon about a young boy who stayed in his mother's womb for years, and when he nearly came out he was able to speak. The RST thing he talked about was how miserable he was there in the womb, in that bloody prison. So we've been suffering all along, and the way we dealt with our suffering from those very early times probably still has an impact on how we deal with it now. Say there's a pain in your leg. You probably have a mental image of that pain, maybe a visual image, a tactile image, a sense of its shape. Back as a child, when you believed in ghosts, you may have seen the pain as a ghost. It was a thing with a will, and you thought it was coming after you. You didn't know any better. But even though your conscious mind knows better now, a lot of your subconscious thoughts may not know better. This is one of the reasons why we have to meditate, to get the mind still enough so you can see these subconscious thoughts in action. You have to understand that the mind's not divided into two sections, the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. It's just that there's conscious behavior in the mind and unconscious behavior, conscious events and unconscious events. One of the purposes of meditation is to get the mind more still, so that things that used to be subconscious can become conscious. It's like bringing them up into the light of day. Or you can compare it to tuning into a radio station. The more precisely you're on the frequency, the less static there is. The less static, the more clearly you can hear the signal. You pick up a lot of the subtleties you couldn't hear before because the static was obscuring them. You get the mind still so that you can begin to discern the suffering around the pain. You'll be working on two levels. One is the physical pain itself, and the other is the mental suffering. Doctors have shown that our perception of pain is really dependent on a lot of mental factors. This is something you're going to see as you meditate, and it's something that we can each know only for ourselves. Doctors can run tests and not ND any physical basis for the pain in the body, but the person really is experiencing pain. They can look at the pain center in the brain to see whether it's activated or not, but they can't tell you how your pain feels. So just the physical pain itself has a lot of mental factors, And the most important one is the factor of perception, the way we label things. Sometimes the word sana is also translated as memory, which is not really accurate. Memory plays a role in perception. We apply our old perceptions of pain to our new experience of pain, but memory deals with the past. Here we're trying to focus on the present, and yet we use our memories from the past to cover up the present, to shape our experience of the present. Say, when there's a pain in your leg, a pain in your waist, a pain in the back, what perceptions does the mind apply to it? If you can't see the process in action, you can try consciously applying different perceptions. As you work in concentration, you should be getting some practice in this because, after all, each of the stages of concentration, all the way up to the dimension of nothingness, is called a perception attainment. For example, when you're working with the breath, the label of breath should be your primary perception. The label you apply to your experience of the body is breath, not only the in and out breath. Try to experience all the different parts of your body as types of breath energy. If your arm really were breath energy, would it be good breath energy or blocked breath energy? Just try applying that label very consistently to the sensation of the arm, and after a while your experience of the arm is going to change. Try applying it to all the different parts of your body. See how that changes the way you experience those parts. You'll see that the actual physical experience of the body is going to change because of the mental label. And the advantage of this is that you can start doing different things with the sensations. If you perceive a particular sensation as something solid, there's not much you can do with it. If you perceive it as blocked energy, there are ways to unblock energy. You can figure out how to redirect it, how to loosen up the blockage. In other words, the perception is useful because you can do things with it. If you stick with that perception of the breath, trying to keep it as constant as possible, you learn two things. One is that you get more and more sensitive as to what you're doing in order to maintain the perception. You start seeing the process of perception a lot more clearly. 2. You get the breath to calm down, so that it's really, really still. Once the breath energy throughout the body seems to down nicely, it'll get more and more subtle. If you stick with your one perception, you end that the brain uses a lot less oxygen. And so you need to breathe less, until you nearly get to the point where the oxygen coming in and out of your pores is all you need. The in and out breath grows still. When the breath gets still, your sense of the shape of the body begins to change. The sense of boundary between inside and outside the body begins to dissolve away. You've just got a mist of sensations, and you can change your perception right there. Instead of focusing on the mist, you can focus on the space between those little bits of sensation, and all of a sudden you're with space. If you can hold on to that perception of space long enough, it's going to change your experience of the present moment, your sense of what it's like to have a physical body here. The potential for being a physical body is there, but you choose not to stir up that potential. Just stay with the space. Just this much teaches you a lot about perception. Or before you go to space, you might focus on the different properties in the body, the warmth, the coolness, the sense of heaviness. Perceive the body as all or as all water or as all solid. Just that perception will change the way you experience the body physically. Then perceive all these various properties as balanced. Not too cold, not too hot, not too heavy, not too light. Everything all mixed together just right. This will also teach you a lot about perception. You begin to see the labels you're using a lot more clearly. As you get more and more familiar with your conscious perceptions, you begin to detect the less conscious ones as well. And you're ready to start taking pain apart. One of the RST things you notice when you look at a pain is the sense that it seems to be a solid mass in the body. Is it really? Or is it the result of your perception? Try changing your perception to see what happens. Again, think of the pain as just tiny dots of sensation that can move around, that have space between them. The breath canal through the pain. The blood canal easily through the pain. Try to distinguish which of those sensations are just body sensations and which are the pain sensations, and you begin to realize that all the things you used to glom together are actually lots of different kinds of sensation. Only the way you perceived them was what made them so threatening. You may have picked up that old way of perceiving because you thought that putting a boundary around the pain was a good way of dealing with it. Putting a boundary around the pain, you thought, might keep it from spreading. But when you really look at the process of putting up and maintaining that boundary, you begin to see that often it's an unskillful way of dealing with the pain. So you can replace that perception with more skillful ones. Then you can look at the other perceptions and thought fabrications that gather around the pain, the stories the mind tells itself about how long you've had this pain, or how much you've suffered in life, and poor you. All this suffering, all this pain. You begin to ask yourself, do you really have to believe those stories? Can you stop making the stories for a little while? See what happens. Pain is an excellent place to start seeing all the different processes in the mind, because you begin to see that it's not only a physical pain. There's a lot of mental activity around the pain that can cause the really important pain, the really important suffering. In other words, the mental burden you build up around a pain. If you look carefully, you can see these different stories, these different perceptions, simply as events in the mind, and you can just drop the habit of listening to them and believing them. See what happens. What you're doing is not totally dropping the habit of perception. You're applying new perceptions because you are the more skillful. This is the Buddha's approach to all of the aggregates. You're not trying to do away with form, feeling, perception, thought constructs, and consciousness, at least not right away. The RST thing you've got to do is learn how to convert them into the path. They use the word aggregates heaps for the word kanda. You might think of them as big heaps of gravel. And you have the choice. You can put the gravel in a bag and carry it around on your shoulder, weighing yourself down, or you can figure out a way of turning it into an asphalt covering for your road. Put it down on the ground, mix it with a binding agent, and then you have a smooth road to walk on. The binding agent here is mindfulness and alertness. Learning to be very mindful and alert about how you use these different aggregates. After all, the aggregates themselves aren't really things. They're activities. They're events in the mind. You begin to see that even your experience of form itself is acted by perception. And you begin to approach all these things by being mindful and alert. Mindful means keeping what you want to do in mind, keeping in mind your desire to put an end to stress. Alert means seeing if you're really doing it, and at the same time seeing the results of what you're doing. Both of these qualities require perceptions. And then there's ardency. Being ardent means that if you see yourself causing stress, you try your best to figure out other ways of acting. These three qualities, mindfulness, alertness, and ardency, are the binding agents that turn these events, these aggregates, into the path. And they require perceptions, concepts, in order to do their work. So we're not condemning the conceptual mind, we're not condemning the mind that perceives things and puts labels on them. We're learning to look at the process of perception and figure out how to do it more skillfully. Ultimately, you do get to an experience that goes beyond the aggregates, but the only way to get there is to develop this path, turning the aggregates from a burden on your shoulder to a smooth road under your feet. So if you want to understand perception, the RST thing you've got to do is learn how to do it consciously. The more consciously you stick with a particular perception, such as breath or space, the more you can understand how the mind fashions perceptions. You begin to detect where to look to see the less conscious perceptions, the ones causing stress and pain. You see them in action and you can drop them, replacing them with other perceptions that are more skillful until finally you get to the point where you don't need them at all. Strategies for happiness. August 26, 2004. Those chants are often juxtaposed just before we meditate. The world is swept away. This body is led with all sorts of unclean things. And then, may I be happy. The purpose of this juxtaposition is to make you stop and think. Given this swept away world, this unclean, decaying body, where does true happiness lie? Where does a safe and secure happiness lie? This is the big question we have to ask ourselves, because everybody wants happiness. As the Buddha said, all things, all phenomena that you can experience are rooted in desire. And what is the desire? It's the desire for happiness. The body, events in the mind, they all come from our desire for happiness. And we act on that desire, sometimes in skillful and sometimes in unskillful ways. That's why the situation we're living in is such a mixed bag, in terms of being satisfactory or not. You have to look carefully at your actions to see which ones really are conducive to happiness, and which ones are not. You can't rest secure in the notion that there's somebody out there taking care of everything, and it's all going to turn out all right in the end. We are the ones who are shaping our experience, and if we're not careful, we're going to shape things in an unskillful way. The Buddha saw that all of our activities are aimed at happiness. And what was especially interesting is that he saw how much of what we experience is an activity. Even our sense of self, of who we are, is an activity. It's a fabrication. We fabricate the decision to identify with certain things. The thought that I am the thought of identification is an act of putting things together. It's a fabrication, an activity, aimed at happiness. And to some extent it works. People who have a very poorly formed sense of self have trouble managing their lives. A certain level of identification is needed, a certain sense of self is needed, just to function properly. And so, in learning to be more skillful, the Buddha has us take that sense of self and try to make it more coherent, so that it can promote your desire for true happiness, a happiness that lasts. Then you ask yourself, what am I doing that's actually leading in that direction? What am I doing that's leading in the other direction? This involves maintaining a sense of what in Pali is called hiri and atapa. Shame and fear of evil. In other words, shame at the idea of doing something you know would be harmful, and fear of the consequences of doing harmful things. This type of fear, the Buddha said, is a useful kind of fear. It's what keeps us on the path. And it requires a certain sense of self, a certain sense of self-esteem, and the opposite of apathy, realizing that what you do is important, for it's going to have consequences down the line, and you don't want to sewer the consequences of unskillfulness. This is what keeps you on the path. The sense that there are dangers out there, and that the dangers lie in your unskillful actions. But this training also implies trust. Trust that you can do things in the proper way, trust in the principle that your actions really do matter, and trust that the quest for happiness is a good quest, if you do it properly. If you take your quest for happiness seriously, the Buddha says, you actually end up developing qualities that are the opposite of selfishness: compassion, wisdom, and purity. First, compassion. You realize that if your happiness depends on the sewering of other people, it's not going to last. Other people want happiness too, and they're not going to sit around and allow you to maintain any happiness that oppresses them. They're going to destroy it. So if you're really sincere about happiness, you also want to include their happiness in the equation. You develop the quality of compassion, taking the happiness of other people into account. As for wisdom, the Buddha said that the sign of a wise person is realizing that sometimes the things you like to do are going to cause suffering, and the things you don't like to do are going to cause happiness. It's a measure of your wisdom to realize that and to act accordingly. In other words, you have to appreciate the principle of causality, for it's going to affect your happiness. That way you get wiser and wiser about causes and effects. If you're wise, you look for a happiness that's secure and long-term, rather than just simply what you can grab at any moment. And as for purity, as the Buddha told his son Rahula, really paying careful attention to your actions and their results, and resolving not to repeat mistakes that cause suffering for yourself or for other people. That's how people attain purity. So compassion, wisdom, and purity, the qualities we associate with the Buddha, come from taking our quest for happiness seriously. Good things come from this sense of self that wants to end a long-term happiness. Ultimately though, as we all know, the Buddha also teaches not self. In other words, showing us that the things we tend to identify with can get in the way of a higher level of happiness. But always keep in mind that even here the quest for happiness lies in the background. It's the overriding issue. You have to become skillful in the way you manage your happiness, realizing that being generous, being virtuous, training the mind are things you have to do, that you're responsible for your happiness, and have to develop these qualities that are harmless both to yourself and to others. Once you've got that principle in mind, then you can start turning to the teaching on not self. You see that the various things you identify with leave you open to all kinds of dangers. If you identify with things that are impermanent, things that can be changed by causal conditions beyond your control, you're putting yourself in a weak position, an exposed, dangerous position. And this is where the teaching on not self comes in. Ajahn Mahabua compares this teaching to a stick that you use hit the hand of a monkey that's always grabbing at things. It's a warning to yourself that if you reach into it's going to burn you, so you have to slap your hand away from the Many people resist the teaching on not self and all the teachings that are preparatory for that, like the chant we had just now on the body. They feel that these teachings are going to deprive them of the strategies they use to end happiness. But these teachings are meant to protect you from sewering. They're there to remind you that if you latch onto the body as yours in a really strong sense, you're going to sewer. If you can see it as a tool that you use toward happiness, that's a different issue. But so many of us don't see it in that way. The body is us. It's ours. But what happens to the body? It gets old, and it can get sick in all sorts of horrible ways even before you get old. And it's not the case that these things happen only to people who don't take care of their bodies. They happen to everybody and can happen at any time. If you identify with the body, you're leaving yourself exposed to all sorts of problems, to all sorts of dangers. The same holds true for feelings, perceptions, thought constructs, and consciousness. But the Buddha doesn't have you just drop and abandon these things, he has you turn them into the path. In other words, you take these things you identify with and you turn them into tools. Once they're tools, it's possible to get a sense of distance from them, and yet still get some use out of them as well. In this way, the strategy of not self, instead of depriving you of your strategies for happiness, actually provides you with a wider range of strategies. As we're meditating here, what are we focusing on? We're focusing on the body, focusing on the breath. We're learning to maximize the feelings of pleasure that come from the breath. We're learning ways of perceiving the breath energy in the body that create stronger and stronger states of concentration. We're learning to direct our thoughts and evaluate the breath. That's fabrication, and to be consciously aware of all this. So you've got all the aggregates here turned into a path. There will be a sense of identification with the path, but it's different from just plain old straight identifying with these things. There's a more skillful use of them so that they lead to a greater and greater sense of well-being and security. As you get more identified with the path in this way, the other things outside that you used to identify as you and yours that if they changed were going to cause big trouble in your life, you can pull away from those attitudes because you have a better place to be. You try to focus all of your desires around maintaining this sense of peace and well-being in the mind. At some point, when that peace and well-being is really secure, you can undercut those desires as well, seeing that even here in this state of concentration, there's still inconstancy, there's still stress. And seeing that, you can let go entirely. You've seen that it's possible for there to be a dimension where there's no sense of I am, no sense of identification, and yet it's not annihilation. In fact, it is just the opposite. The only thing that gets annihilated there are stress and sewering. That's what we're aiming for as we learn to take our desire for happiness seriously and to follow it through in a consistent way. Then, as Ajahn Suwat once said, when you reach the ultimate happiness, who cares if there's a self or not a self, or whether you can envy someone who's experiencing this or what? It doesn't matter, for what is there is the ultimate happiness. Even though the Buddha talks a lot about sewering and stress, the unattractiveness of the body, the lack of control you have over things, it's not for a negative or pessimistic purpose. It's to focus your desire for happiness in another direction. And he says, look, you can't end true happiness in these places. You've got to look someplace else. This is the theme underlying all of his teachings. That true happiness really does matter. It's important. It's worth giving yourself over to. The desire for true happiness is worth taking seriously because it actually leads to true happiness if you follow through with it skillfully. So although sometimes we may resist his teachings because they seem to threaten our ideas about what we need to do and to believe in order to be happy, it's good to step back and question our assumptions. There are many people who have followed the Buddha's way and found that, yes, it does lead to a true happiness, and that the happiness you get from following other paths doesn't nearly compare. When you see fear in your practice, remember, there is skillful fear and unskillful fear. Skillful fear focuses on the harm and suffering that comes from doing unskillful things. Unskillful fear comes from holding on to things that you know are going to change. Once you understand this, you can work on renewing your sense of self and ultimately learn to adopt the teaching on not self as well. When you learn how to use these teachings skillfully at their appropriate times, in the appropriate places and they really are conducive to happiness, then you see that there's nothing to criticize in the Buddha's teachings. They're there to help us the happiness we want. He's not forcing them on anybody. There's no power play involved here at all. He offers his teachings out of compassion. He's found that these practices work for him, and they work for other people as well. It's simply a question of whether we understand them properly and learn how to use them skillfully. When we do, there are no more issues. Freedom Uned. December 17, 2004. There's a passage in the Dhammapada where the Buddha says that life as a householder is difficult, life as a monk gone forth is difficult. Then he ends by saying, so be neither. Of course, what he means by that is to end a way of not having to be anything at all. That requires practice. It's a skill. The skill we're working on right here, the skill that takes you out of having to live the household life or have to live the life of a monk. Without this skill, those are the only choices you have. Derived from them are lots of other little choices, but they're all trapped inside those two categories. What we're looking for is a path of practice that leads to freedom from any kind of category at all. As the Buddha said, what you are is limited, measured by what you cling to. So the path beyond categories has to be a path that gets rid of clinging. When you hold on to the body, that's what you are. When you hold on to any of the other aggregates, you're classified as a feeling clinger, a perception clinger, a mental fabrication, or consciousness clinger. You create your identity by what you cling to. This is why the Buddha never answered questions about what a human being is, because a human being can be almost anything. So this noble eightfold path that we're following here is a path that gets us out of having to be identified with anything, of having to be limited to anything. That's the skill we're working on. It's not an easy skill, but when you realize that all of the alternatives out there are difficult, then you realize that it doesn't make much sense to focus on the difficulties of the path, for at the very least this is a path that leads to a way out. 3 years ago, when I sensed that Ajahn Suwat was about to pass away, I went to see him in Thailand. It was inspiring and heartening to see him, because even though he went through a lot of difficulties after his accident, paralyzed from the base of the spine on down, brain damage, lung damage, having to deal with very difficult people looking after him, he always maintained his good cheer. One of the last things he said to me was that he had begun to notice that the perceptions his brain was sending to him were getting weirder and weirder all the time. He had to learn how not to listen to them. Then he said, but that thing I got from the meditation, that hasn't changed. That's always there. That thing is what he called it. That's the freedom we're working toward, so that no matter what happens in terms of aging, illness, and death, there is always that thing there. That's what we want to ferret out. That's what we want to know. So we foster the customs of the noble ones, which focus on taking delight in this path of letting go and developing. You let go of the patterns of thought, speech, and action that get in the way of clear knowing. You develop the qualities that encourage clear knowing. Right view, right ear, right mindfulness, right concentration. You learn to take enjoyment in these things. You let them capture your imagination. They've done studies of people who are expert in L's involving skill and dexterity, and they've discovered that what sets the experts apart from people who are just good at those skills is that the skill captures their imaginations. 1. They like doing it. 2. They like rising to the challenge. If they make mistakes, they try to learn from them. One article tells of the admissions OC in a very famous school of surgery. For years they were working on the questions asked at the applicant interviews to try to guru out which questions would ferret out the people who didn't have the potential to be surgeons, as opposed to those who did. Because it was one of the best schools in the country, all the applicants had great grades, great recommendations, but that was no guarantee that they'd actually do well when faced with a patient on the table. The admissions people discovered a pair of questions that were most accurate in guruing out who to admit and who not to admit. The RST was, "Can you tell us about a mistake you made recently?" If the applicant said, "No, I can't think of any mistakes I made recently," he or she would be rejected. The second question was, "What would you do differently if you had the chance to do it again?" If the person was able to jump right in and say, "I thought that next time around I might try this," that was the sort of person they wanted, someone who would look at his or her actions, recognize a mistake, and then immediately want to guru out how to not make that mistake again, someone who exercised ingenuity in trying to guru out another approach. All across the board, the ones who excel at their skills, whether as musicians, sportsmen, or craftsmen, are the ones who ND that the skill captures their imagination. That's why the effort put into the skill is no big deal for them. They get so absorbed that the effort becomes enjoyable. They like thinking about it, they like guruing out the problems they face, and sometimes detecting problems that other people might not even notice. Then they try working out solutions. These are the kind of people who do well. The same principle applies in the customs of the noble ones. You delight in letting go, you delight in developing. Working on the qualities of your mind really captures your imagination. That way, the difficulties of living in a community with other people who are also practicing aren't big issues. You've got the rules, you've got the structure, you've got the support to do the practice. It's not so much that you're here to learn about Buddhism, you're learning to use the tools that Buddhism offers to sort out your own mind. First, the tools help you look at the habits, the things the mind is doing. Then, when you notice that what you're doing is causing suffering to yourself or other people, you have the tools to change those habits. If the classic tools don't work, you can use your own ingenuity to extrapolate on them. When you ND that captures your imagination, then the difficulties don't really impress themselves on your mind. The whole purpose of this practice is to focus on what's actually happening in your mind. The big questions are, what are you doing that's causing unnecessary suffering for yourself or for other people? What can you do to stop doing that? These questions apply not only to things you do and say, but also the way your mind operates, the way the mind treats itself, the way it deals with its own thoughts and feelings. You want these questions to take charge. This requires a shift in your center of gravity, because for a lot of us, we have a strong sense of who we are, with our activities as something secondary, something in service of the who that we are. If we take our sense of ourself, of who we are, as the absolute, then the question of what we're doing becomes relative. Then the preferences of that self take over, and the path becomes hard. But if you switch things around so that the question of becoming more skillful in your actions becomes your absolute, while your sense of who you are becomes relative to that question, then the path becomes a lot easier. It's a lot more enjoyable. It makes sense. This is why the Buddha focused his Four Noble Truths on precisely this question, because that's what the Four Truths are. An issue of skillful action, desirable result, unskillful action, undesirable result. They're a way of sorting those issues out. As for the other questions concerning the world, the oneness or plurality of the universe, the existence of a self, the nature of the life force, the fate of an awakened person after death, those questions get set aside. Those are not the issues. The issues are what is skillful, what is not. When those questions become the center of your concern, when they capture your imagination, then issues of world and self fall to the wayside. This gives you a beginning sense of what it's like to be freed from the question of who you are, what kind of person you are, because you realize that those issues are all determined by the skill with which you act, particularly the skill with which you approach your clingings, your attachments. Those are the determining issues. When you learn how to practice, developing concentration and discernment to see through those clingings, then the whole need to identify yourself, limit yourself, measure yourself, goes by the wayside. As you follow the path, the soarings caused by the need to deny yourself grow lighter and lighter. Even more so when all the clinging is gone. That's it, no need to be denied by anything at all. There's a passage where a monk has been asked by some people from outside of the Buddha's teachings about how the Buddha answers the question of whether the awakened person exists or not after death. The monk, extemporizing, answers that there has to be an answer beside the four that are usually given. Existing, not existing, both, neither. His questioners all make fun of him. You don't know anything about the Buddha's teaching, they sneer. Even people outside the teaching knew that. So the monk goes to see the Buddha. The Buddha says, "How can you say anything like that? Can you identify where the Tathagata is right now? Can you deny him in terms of any of the V aggregates?" Well, no. As something separate from the V aggregates? No. There's nothing that you could point to, even here in the present moment, unlike your ordinary person, who can be identified with his clingings. The Buddha went on to say, when you can't even identify the Tathagata here and now, how can you say anything about what he is after death, or how he exists, or what his mode of being is after death? Total freedom. Indescribable and undenied. That's what this practice is all about. If the idea of total freedom captures your imagination, then the difficulties get smaller and smaller. Even though they may be large in your mind right now, they start looming smaller and smaller as you stick with the path. The Buddha once said that if you could make a deal that every day for 100 years you'd be speared with 100 spears in the morning, 100 spears at noon, 100 spears in the evening, 300 spear wounds every day, but with a guarantee that in 100 years you'd gain full awakening, that would be a deal worth taking. When the awakening came, you wouldn't consider that it had been gained with difficulty. It's up to you to decide whether you find that passage intriguing. Then again, you can look at the alternative. What life is like if you don't. In keeping with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the profound significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this voluminous 1,000-page tome into an easily accessible audio format. Now, the responsibility to further this noble cause rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and content shares, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's uphold the age-old tradition of sharing knowledge and fostering mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We invite you to join us in this mission, and together, we can create a profound impact on the lives of many.